In the late 40s, Italy seemed on the brink of voting communists into power. In towns and villages across the country, makeshift cinemas showed films of communists violating Catholic churches. The films were paid for by the CIA. It was an example of what they called political action, techniques of fighting communism in countries outside the communist bloc.
I would rate it as one of the most successful covert operations in the history of American intelligence.
Techniques varied. The CIA once made a blue movie apparently starring President Sukarno of Indonesia.
Put yourself back in 1957-58. Then skin was a big word. Today, I would give this movie, this little film of 10 or 15 minutes, a rating of PG-13 in the American film industry.
The CIA judged Sukarno dangerously pro-communist.
I was the executive director, I was the producer, I was the cameraman, and I was the one who made it appear as though Sukarno had been compromised while he had his little trip to the Kremlin.
Italy was the target of the first campaign of political action ever mounted by the CIA. William Colby worked as an agency political officer in Rome in the 1950s. He felt he was taking part in a crusade against communism.
Everybody was excited at the challenge and the need to meet the challenge, and the self-sacrifice and dedication was very much there to go out and do what was necessary to defend Western civilization. And I'm not being hyperbolic when I'm talking about that. It was Western civilization that was at stake.
Throughout the Cold War, Italy had the strongest communist party in Western Europe, able to mobilize massive support in industrial cities like Turin. In the late 1940s, communist chances of winning power through the ballot box looked very good. To help deal with the threat, the CIA assigned Mark Wyatt to northern Italy.
In Italy, there was, I think, a real battleground of the Cold War. Above all, the success of communism in Italy was due to communist leadership, and I mean specifically the leader, Palmiro Togliatti. He was able to suitably tailor the Kremlin directives to the Italian temperament, and this was a remarkable feat. The most important thing to Togliatti was to grasp a political base among labor, among the workers of Italy. We had, within a very short period of time, let's say mid-1947, the great workers' organization of Italy was a tool of the Communist Party. It was completely in their hands.
Italy stands at the crossroads of history as her millions of qualified voters stream to the polls to determine whether she shall remain a free republic or sink silently behind the Iron Curtain in the gray zone where slave nations are governed by Moscow's will. The election, which lasts almost 2 full days, is held under the watchful eyes of 300,000 troops and police. It is the culmination of a bitter battle in which both Western powers and Russia exert strong pressure. Leading freedom-loving Italians...
Alcide de Gasperi led the Christian Democrats. They were the party of the Roman Catholic Church, and they were strongly assisted by the CIA.
His followers are supported by millions of letters from Italian Americans and hundreds of shiploads of American food.
The letters mentioned in that newsreel were part of a propaganda campaign organized by the agency among Italian-American communities in Brooklyn and other cities. The drive to mobilize opinion at home to help win an election in Italy was part of the CIA's first experiment in political action. John LaCourte was recruited to organize the letter-writing campaign.
I used to go out in the Italian community in Brooklyn in particular, and explain to them. And I became known as the spokesman for Stop the Communists in Italy. And with the help of the church in Brooklyn, the clergy explained to them the danger. And the clergy, every Sunday, used to talk to the parishioners that the John LaCourte program deserve consideration.
Our Lady of Mount Carmel, pray for us. San Paulino, pray for us. Have a great day.
And we started this letter-writing campaign. And before we knew, the thing was gaining momentum. One man tells another man to write another letter. So that's the reason we got almost 1 million letters within a week or so. It was a miracle.
Not entirely a miracle. Italian-American newspapers carried ready-made letters and telegrams which their readers just had to cut out and send to Italy.
The CIA made it possible for John LaCourte to achieve what he did. He made contacts and undermined the communists and spread the message and convince the Italian people that this was a serious issue. It was not politics. Was a question of surviving a people to remain close to the United States.
The propaganda films being shown throughout Italy were part of the same battle. Funded by the CIA, they were distributed by civic committees set up by the Catholic Church. The same organization also ran a very effective anti-communist poster campaign. One of the leading lights of the civic committees, Father Lucio Migliaccio, attended the liaison meetings with agency representatives.
C'era questo grande rapporto di fiducia, che gli americani sapevano che noi si lavoravamo.
There was a great relationship of trust. The Americans knew that we were quite simply working against communism. They didn't care what party we worked for. They gave us this aid. We met round the table for half an hour or 3/4 of an hour. We told them what we were doing and sometimes mentioned the political situation. They gave us a sealed envelope and we gave it to the administrator. That's it.
The Christian Democrat coalition won the 1948 election. To the CIA, it seemed that their political action had won the first round in the fight against communism. But the secret war was by no means over.
Italy's communists scorn the election results. Beaten at the polls, the disgruntled Reds take the aggressive. A masked mob in Milan's Castello Sforzesco hear Luigi Longo, boss of the communists' military organizations, make an inflaming speech threatening revolt.
The catacombs beneath the Turin streets where communists marched had once been used by an Italian resistance hero during the Second World War. Count Edgardo Sonio was later captured and badly beaten by the Germans. His release was negotiated by the American wartime spy master Allen Dulles. In 1953, when Dulles became director of the CIA, Sonio approached him for help against the communists.
Mr. Allen Dulles, that I knew during the war, that was helping me during the German occupation, was in that moment the head of CIA. And I thought that he could do something for me. So I went to Washington, and through our embassy, I met Mr. Dulles, and I explained our problem. I said, we are trying to make propaganda against the Communist Party, but we have no more sufficient means.
Sonio edited the anti-communist magazine Pace e Libertà, Peace and Liberty. Dulles gave him money to keep it going. Sonio published evidence which he said came from the wartime files of Mussolini's secret police. These alleged that the communist leader Palmiro Togliatti had betrayed fellow communists to the fascists.
A shock propaganda with truth. And this was a very effective operation, because people said, just look, the communists are wrong, because they have the courage to go in court and prove that what is said by Pace e Libertà is not true.
One of those on the receiving end of this sort of propaganda was Egidio Solotto. He was the chief communist union organizer in Turin.
Quando mi fanno dei libelli o dei giornali o che so io dove dicono il segretario della...
When they distributed leaflets saying, for instance, that the secretary for the party in Turin is a whoremonger, that the secretary of the Chamber of Labour is dishonest, and so on, with a photo montage showing someone stuck there with a series of half-naked girls, of course this created a situation of mistrust. The fact is, this propaganda cut us off from our own people.
CIA political action was demonstrably successful. At Fiat, the communists lost control of the Works Council in the mid-50s. But it was bringing the agency into contact not just with anti-communist moderates, but also with monarchists and extreme right-wingers.
I felt that the work of Sonio was a plus and something that we should encourage. And in those critical times, it probably would be a little foolhardy to ignore individual people that happened to have a monarchist background who were good fighters against communism.
Like his Renaissance predecessors, Archbishop Montini was a political prince as well as a spiritual leader.
Through an emissary of mine, I learned that the Archbishop of Milan, Montini, who later became Pope Paul, was very much interested in having assistance to acquire loudspeaker trucks connected with civic committees' effort in the campaign to discourage a communist or a leftist socialist vote and to encourage a Christian democratic vote.
The beneficiary of CIA funds became Pope in June 1963. The then head of the CIA was a Roman Catholic called John McCone, and soon afterwards the new Pope agreed to give him an audience. McCone was briefed by Mark Wyatt.
And I told him the story about the speaker trucks and how delighted he was. And I said, you know, Mr. Director, he knew where it was coming from. And I thought, in your casual conversation to this man, you might want to refer to that. And John McCone, who was a very stern and direct man, but a wonderful man, and he turned to me and he said, "What do you want me to do, recruit the Pope?"
It was not perhaps such an outlandish idea. The CIA's links to people at the very top of Italian politics were now very close, though indirect.
We would have so-called cutouts. We would have people on the outside who had no connection with the American government whatsoever. And they would be operating as independent people, ostensibly and apparently to their neighbors, and even to the Italian leaders that they were dealing with.
I was here under a commercial cover. I was pretending to be an employee of an American firm with an office here and the secretary.
Dino Pionzio's real job was for the CIA. It was a delicate one, even in a world used to political deal-making. His task was to liaise with anti-communist politicians and give them money. One recipient was Aldo Moro, then General Secretary of the Christian Democrats. It was the start of a fateful relationship.
At one time, I asked Dr. Moro, I said, why do you take assistance from us? And I was pleased and somewhat surprised to have him say, well, it's the cleanest and the best money that I receive. He said, what do you ask me to do? He said, all you've ever said to me. Well, you want me to support NATO? Well, that, of course, I would do. This is the policy of Italy. You've asked me to keep my party united. But why wouldn't I keep my party united? It's the only way we stay in power. And the last question you asked me is to be anti-communist. Well, that is very natural for me, because if I'm not, they would seize power. He said, so you're not asking me to do a single thing that I wouldn't do in any event.
Dino Pionzio usually dealt with Aldo Moro's political fixer and secretary, Sereno Friato.
Questi anni, che piacere, eh?
Bene, grazie, anche lei ancora tutto
bene. La casa è magnifica, no? Si vive bene qui,
magnifica, sì.
È magnifica.
È pagata dalla CIA, sì.
Sicuro che no.
Sicuro che no,
no, sicuro che no.
Andiamo dentro, fuori, su.
Mi ricordo che venne stabilito da parte americana un aiuto mensile di 60.
I remember that the Americans agreed to a monthly sum of 60 million lire. It was delivered in cash to me personally in a suitcase by the man I was in contact with in Rome. Once a month I got a call from him, and he would suggest some little street in Rome where we should meet, and I would go there by car. He gave me the suitcase, which I took and handed over to the administrative secretary of the party.
Aldo Moro first became Prime Minister in 1963. Neither he nor Friato were to guess how one day the agency's attitude to him would change. Secret political action has fueled suspicion about CIA activities in Italy. In 1959, the agency and the Italian Secret Service set up a clandestine organization codenamed Gladio. Arms for stay-behind guerrillas were buried in northern Italy with a specific plan in mind.
It was a contingency plan, and it was an enlightened, noble plan, prepared for Soviet invasion of Western Europe. I can't think of anything more sensitive.
The communists never invaded, but many years later, evidence emerged suggesting that the Gladio caches had been used by neo-fascist terrorists. The arms were dug up under orders from an investigating magistrate, and the CIA found itself in the glare of unwelcome publicity.
I spent perhaps 0.1% of my time, all the time I was in Italy in that senior position, concerned about the stay-behind operation because it was handled so well by the Italians who ran it. We only helped them do it.
But Gladio recruits who were trained at a military base in Sardinia regarded their organization as an American creation.
Certe apparecchiature che ci avevano fatto vedere non erano certo in dotazione all'esercito italiano. No?
The equipment they showed us wasn't standard Italian army stuff, so we always believed that the organization was fundamentally American. Our exercises were always based on American terms and references.
Riferimenti americani.
The involvement of Gladio in extreme right-wing politics began with its first head, General De Lorenzo. He engineered a conspiracy codenamed Piano Solo to overthrow Italian democracy in 1964.
I dealt with great heroes of democracy in Italy, and they were staunch defenders. People have criticized General De Lorenzo. As I knew General De Lorenzo, he was a roccaforte. He was the strongest man against communism It was tremendous, maybe exaggerated, but God, we needed some exaggerations in those days.
He was later involved in a coup attempt.
So they say. When that man joined the neo-fascist party after he left the military, I was saddened. I thought it was so unfortunate. God, how could this guy go for neo-fascism? And if he wanted to stage a coup, piano solo, whatever it was, I'm again saddened.
In Italy, controversy has long raged about Gladio's role in the right-wing terrorist campaign of the 1970s. It was known as the strategy of tension. The purpose of the violence was to prepare the way for a right-wing takeover. An Italian parliamentary commission now suspects Gladio was involved. So do the communists.
Fa parte dei compiti istituzionali che la Gladio aveva, la funzione della Gladio era quella di riuscire.
It was part of Gladio's institutional task. Gladio's function was to create a situation of continual provocation, with the purpose of isolating the communists and the whole left-wing leadership.
Parte dirigente della sinistra.
Today, most people may have forgotten the violence, but the unraveling of exactly who was involved in the strategy of tension goes on. One Venetian magistrate, Marcello Mastaloni, ordered the digging up of all Gladio arms caches as part of his inquiry into the murder of 2 Italian policemen in 1972. Italian magistrates have wide-ranging powers of investigation. The trail leading to Gladio began with a neo-fascist who confessed to the 1972 murders. He hinted very strongly that Gladio members carried out bombings in Italy. His name was Vincenzo Vinciguerra. The accuracy of his evidence about Gladio in the early 1970s alarmed its then commander.
When he was confessing his offense to the magistrate, he described a kind of operation sponsorized and located inside the NATO with such and such and such and such purposes in a very detailed way, in a very sharp detail, that when I read this confession, I was astonished. He knew everything about Gladio.
Evidence, even if disjointed, that some members of Gladio did have neo-fascist connections convinced General Serravalle that his organization had been infiltrated.
This is a question of infiltration. There is some feeling that somebody else who knew the organization infiltrate other characters, other individuals, just to keep the tension strategy in Italy.
If somebody's trying to say that the Americans were conned into helping this operation because, and they said, look, just for the Soviets, yes, and then later on we can use all these burials or caches for internal matters. CIA knew nothing about that and doesn't know anything about it today.
Either way, the strategy of tension didn't work. Indeed, in the 1970s, under Enrico Berlinguer, the Italian Communist Party, having rejected Moscow, once again stood a good chance of being voted in. The CIA's former protege, Aldo Moro, evolved a response that worried the United States. He decided to sit down with the communists and discuss bringing them into power through a coalition government.
Quanto sono venuto a conoscenza per fatti diretti, invece mi consta di preoccupazioni di ambienti americani.
From my own knowledge, I know that there was alarm in American government circles. This was because they had not understood the latest political operation, which has been attributed to Aldo Moro, but in fact was part of the whole policy of the Christian Democrats.
Secretary of State Kissinger warned Moro about working with the communists. Something far more drastic happened. Moro was kidnapped by the Red Brigades, his bodyguards were killed, the CIA gave no help, and Washington supported the Italian government in its refusal to negotiate with the Red Brigades. Moro was found dead in the boot of a car parked in a Rome street on May the 17th, 1978. Sereno Freato remained a devoted friend of Moro's to the end. Years later, the police found a letter Moro had written to him from captivity. The affair had taught Freato a lesson. Friendship with the CIA did not guarantee help when interests diverged.
In my opinion, nobody did enough, including the Americans.
Americani compresi.
Moro's death galvanized the country against terrorism. But the suspicion that the CIA had unsavory links with the far right in Italy tainted its achievement.
A lot of people feel that the Central Intelligence Agency goes around creating democracies or governments in the American mold. But they should dwell less on our creating things in the American mold than sustaining and helping and keeping alive a fine democratic government like Italy and keeping it from going down the drain. And that's what we did. And I am proud of that achievement.
Indonesia, like Italy, is the home of an ancient civilization. Like Italy, it was also a major target of CIA political action. Today, Indonesia is run by a dictatorship which dislikes inquiry. Everything was filmed here without permission. Tucked away in a remote corner of the country is the shrine of Sukarno, the founder of modern Indonesia. Years after his death, people still come here to pray. To them, he is Bang, or Brother Karno. Sukarno led Indonesia for 20 years. He adopted a classic third world position, not in the communist bloc, but not against it either. To the CIA, he was a target. To his wife, magnetic.
He was a man who reminds me that he loves me every hour, every minute, every second of a day.
Dewi Sukarno was his third wife and an ardent supporter of his politics.
He's a revolutionary man, and all his life he fought for independence.
Sukarno successfully defeated the Dutch after the Second World War, a beneficiary and part of the American war aim of ending the old colonial empires.
Sukarno was like a god. He was a father. He was a father of the nation. He had a great charisma and popularity. People adore him. People worship him.
He had grand plans for his country and needed aid to realize them. But he didn't want it all to come from the United States and made himself popular by saying so.
And again, I repeat, to go to hell with your aid if that aid is meant to keep us in strings.
Well, have you experienced these strings, Mr. President, what
yes.
you call strings?
Oh, yes.
From the United States?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Could
For
you give
example,
us...
with Mr. Black and the IMF, we had a very bad experience.
He called himself non-aligned, but that seemed to mean spending more and more time with communist leaders. The CIA were worried.
I think White House was very scared and afraid of Sukarno's movement and being a leader of non-aligned countries. They were very scared. And America hated him for that. If there is a man who doesn't obey and who sticks to his own convictions. And for America, it's very easy to name their enemy a communist.
In 1957, the CIA took the unusual step of making a blue movie starring a Sukarno lookalike.
I felt that this man was not good for the United States government, did not like his pro-communist leanings, and I felt that whatever little contribution that we could make to destroy him was advantageous to my country.
At the National Airport, President Sukarno was greeted by high American officials. Vice President Nixon and Secretary of State Dulles were among those who welcomed the leader of the sixth most populous nation on the globe.
The decision to try and smear Sukarno followed an outwardly friendly visit to the United States in which Robert Mayhew learnt a lot about him.
We had been told that every night he had to have a date. And the State Department was concerned that he might be compromised. So they asked me if I would check with my police sources throughout his stops as to whether or not the girls that had been provided for him had any criminal record or were the type that could in any way compromise him.
Continuing a busy schedule, he visited the famous studios of Hollywood. And finally, Disneyland, the fantasy created for children by Walt Disney.
When he left here, he went to Russia. They put him up at the Kremlin and furnished him with a gorgeous, good-looking young girl. When he left the Kremlin, he took her with him. And needless to say, she was one of that bright intelligence agents. So I was asked if I thought I could get Larry Crosby. They knew he was a friend of mine. And his brother Bing to assist me in making a movie in Hollywood. I told Bing the exact truth. And Bing said that he'd be very happy to cooperate with his government any chance he had. And he laughingly said, he says, do we have any more movies we could make, Bob, to get rid of these bastards that are plaguing us in the world?
Be honest with me, dear, whatever you do. Remember your mind, dear, so always be true.
The CIA thought that a film ostensibly showing Sukarno in bed with a KGB agent would be very damaging. It would suggest that the great lover was being controlled through a woman.
Be honest with me. My poor heart would break, dear, if you...
The agency made still photographs from the film which were to be quietly distributed among Asian newspapers with an appropriate accompanying text.
Unfortunately, as with a lot of these plans, this backfired, particularly in the third world, where we did put some of these pictures in some of the local press. It got backfired in the sense that, oh, good for him. He's in bed with a white woman. He's doing it to a white woman, and not a local, and not a dark skin. He's doing it to the whites. Well, it backfired. It enhanced him rather than detracted from him.
In Indonesia, Sukarno was by no means universally popular, and he was the target of several assassination attempts. His own circle believed that they were CIA-inspired.
He has been trying to be assassinated 5 times by Americans while I was even there. He was literally attacked. One time, 5 meters, he was nearly to be shot. And another time when he was making an inspection in a school, somebody threw him a bomb and children were killed.
The agency later admitted considering plans to assassinate Sukarno.
Of course, we believe with CIA. CIA has been very powerful on those days, very powerful.
In the mid-1950s, the CIA planned a major political action campaign in Indonesia. Dean Olney was sent in to assess its chances. The United States was increasingly concerned about the growth of the Indonesian Communist Party, now one of the strongest outside the Soviet bloc. Faced by growing opposition to his spendthrift government, Sukarno sought communist support. As in Italy, there seemed a real danger that Indonesia would fall under communist control.
There were 1.5 million members of the Communist Party of Indonesia. It was the largest party outside the bloc. They were making no bones about what their intentions were. The man on the street would tell you this country's going communist.
Much of the opposition was at the island of Sumatra. In 1957, Olney drove across the island to meet a disgruntled army officer.
I had $50,000 stuck under my shirt because I was all alone and unarmed in an area which I had to drive through, an area where there had been quite a bit of banditry. I got stopped, and I actually had, people come and stick rifles in the window at my head and so on and ask me who the blazes I was. I usually dropped the name of some bully boy in the area and said, please give him my regards. And that usually took care of the guard temporarily for me to get in the Jeep and drive further down the road.
His cover was that he was doing routine diplomatic business, but his real orders were to find out whether Indonesian units in Sumatra would rebel against Sukarno. The army officer Olney went to see was Colonel Simbolon.
I knew that he was in the American consulate, and we talked about the political situation here in Indonesia and the alarming revival of the Communist Party, you see. He knew that I was vehemently anti-communist. Anyhow, he gave the picture that because of the Cold War, you see, because of the Cold War, that if an anti-communist insurgence will occur in Indonesia, that the Americans might come to their help.
Simbolon and his fellow officers set up their own government with CIA support. Huge amounts of arms were supplied by sea and air. In early 1958, the average Indonesian rebel had more equipment per head than American GIs did during the Korean War. At the time, this was the agency's largest political operation ever.
I didn't have the thought at the time that I was violating any moral principles. This was a matter of fighting the KGB and communism, fighting fire with fire. And I didn't have any second thoughts about it at all, and I still don't.
Crack paratroops of Indonesia's central government make an airborne assault on a stronghold of the Central Sumatra rebels, one of the first counter-moves by the pro-communist guided democracy of Premier Sukarno against the anti-red movement. But they land unopposed, as do amphibious forces moving against the shores of the oil and rubber-rich island.
The rebellion in Sumatra collapsed. CIA political action did not include overt U.S. intervention. They did nothing more to help their friends.
Colonel Simbolon said that he had strong forces, but nobody ever figured that he wouldn't be able to get his men to fight, and they didn't. So if you want to call it an intelligence failure, I guess you could. We didn't have the intelligence.
Colonel Simbolon was now on his own.
I felt disappointed and left abandoned. I felt that we were being used only, and because we failed, in their eyes, they left. They pulled out. It's as simple as that. That's the lesson I learned.
In 1965, something happened which was to give the United States an anti-communist Indonesia. 6 army generals were hacked to death in an apparent communist attempt to seize power. Other generals hit back, took control themselves, and effectively marginalized President Sukarno. Afterwards, the communists were wiped out.
Since 1965, November, I was operation officer to crush the whole Communist Party and forces. I was in charge at the time.
It looks as if it was more by luck than CIA judgment that anti-communists had gained the upper hand. Immediately following the coup attempt, demonstrators ran amok while the army set about exacting revenge for its murdered generals.
It is a kind of hunting. Morally, they were completely down, the Communist Party at the time. They submerged, most of them, but with the help of the people, it's very easy to catch them, No problem with that.
A CIA officer, Ralph McGehee, believed the agency's attitude encouraged the killings.
I saw a secret study about the agency's role in Indonesia at this particular time. I saw this study because I was custodian of it. It would indicate that the agency's role precipitated the massacre that followed in Indonesia that destroyed up to 1 million people.
That was a time of to be or not to be. That was a time of either you kill or to be killed at the time. That kind of situation we were facing, you see.
The Communist Party had been strong in country areas. The search there got out of control. Many innocent people were murdered. One of the few people who's prepared to talk about it describes what he saw.
The thousands of people killed were first given rice to eat, then put on a truck and brought to a field. Their hands tied, they were blindfolded. They were shot from behind. If they had many people, they just machine-gunned them. If the numbers were small, they just killed them one by one, and the dead bodies were thrown into the valley. If anyone still showed signs of life, a big stone was dropped on their heads, and they were buried, regardless of whether they were dead or alive.
State Department documents show that the new Indonesian leaders asked for weapons and supplies to help crush the PKI, the Indonesian Communist Party. But the United States was preoccupied with the Vietnam War at the time, so the scope for help was limited.
The decision was made to give them the radio equipment and medical supplies, but no arms, no small arms, nothing. I think that Washington figured this is one area where we can be of assistance without sullying ourselves with involvement in an internecine bloodletting, if there is such a thing. And so let's go along with this. It was a halfway course, which I think was very reasonable.
As with Gladio in Italy, the long relationship between the CIA and the Indonesian army had unfortunate consequences. After the coup attempt on September the 30th, lists of communists were given to the Indonesian army by a State Department officer at the U.S. Embassy.
After the September 30 affair occurred, an Indonesian came to me who was closely connected with the military, the Indonesian army. So we talked, and well, I passed perhaps anywhere from 1,000 to several thousand names in these various lists. I do not know the exact number. Over a period of perhaps a couple of months in November, December 1965.
It's not extraordinary that it was done by a State Department officer because of the country team concept, where every element of the U.S. presence is brought together to make a contribution.
CIA officers who were in Indonesia at the time strongly reject the suggestion that they share responsibility in the arrests and killings.
In 1965, America has named Sukarno followers that they are communist, almost giving a legalization to murder these people. In 1966 till 69, in these 3 years, approximately close to 2 million people were killed in Indonesia.
One hopes, since people are looking for ways to point the finger at the United States, that we aren't going to be accused of genocide. I mean, it's very discomforting to have that sort of a thing thrown in your face. You know, it's more than discomforting, it makes you bloody angry. And so I'd be very happy to see a more concrete sort of coming to grips with the problem.
Either way, the agency got what it wanted. Sukarno, now only a figurehead, was soon to be deposed.
I, President, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces of the Republic of Indonesia, appoint Major General Suharto. Where is the man? This man. I appoint him as Minister, Commander.
In Indonesia, instead of being a force which was trying to organize the entire Pacific Rim against the United States, against the free world, against the United Nations and so on, that was no longer happening. It was a source of great satisfaction that Indonesia was apparently going to rejoin the family of nations.
For tourists, at least, Indonesia's image today is that of a benign and prosperous paradise. In political terms, it's still run by the tough military dictatorship which seized power back in the 60s. But they are anti-communist, and in the context of the Cold War, that counts as a success for America.
Remember, the CIA role is not usually to do the whole job. It's to support local people, to make their efforts somewhat more effective. And we came and afforded a little extra support to our side of the battle. We didn't set up a model of the Soviet effort and then control it the way they controlled their model. We just added to the strength that was against them in that area.
For the CIA, the lesson of Indonesia was the same as that of Italy. Adding to local strengths did not mean exerting control over what happened. Sometimes the CIA found themselves in bed with very uncomfortable companions.